Racist cop blocks black woman inside court, but she's the federal inspector evaluating the entire bench. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the main character. Tamara Johnson stepped into the courtroom with a kind of quiet confidence that often went unnoticed. She was dressed in a simple navy blazer and trousers, her natural curls pulled back neatly. She wasn't there for any personal reason, but rather as part of her job, an undercover federal inspector tasked with evaluating the actions of the entire judicial bench. She'd seen many courtrooms in her time, but none quite like this one. The air in the room felt thick, tense with unspoken judgments. As she walked past the rows of chairs, her presence seemed to make the room uneasy. There were whispers, quick glances, and a palpable discomfort in the atmosphere, as if people were not sure whether to acknowledge her or pretend she didn't belong. As Tamara approached the seating area, a voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, you can't just walk in here," Officer Thomas Kane called out sharply. His tone was dismissive, laced with a kind of arrogance that often accompanied authority figures who thought they held all the cards. Tamara paused, meeting his gaze with a calm expression. He wasn't going to stop her. "I'm here for the trial," she replied smoothly, her voice steady, betraying no hint of hesitation. But Officer Kane was having none of it. He eyed her suspiciously, his posture rigid. "I said you can't just walk in here. You don't belong." His words were deliberate, as if trying to assert his dominance in the situation. The murmurs of the onlookers grew louder, as some of the court staff began to look up. Tamara remained silent for a moment, allowing the tension to build. "I'm just here to observe," she finally said, her voice calm but firm. Yet, Officer Kane was unrelenting. "Not on my watch," he muttered under his breath. "You better step outside." His words echoed in the quiet room, drawing the attention of others who now stared at her, unsure of how to react. But Tamara remained composed, unmoved by his blatant rudeness. The officer's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, ready to make an example out of her. She stood her ground, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The room held its collective breath. But just as Officer Kane took another step toward her, a sudden shift in the air made him pause. His posture stiffened. The door at the back of the room swung open, and the judge entered, signaling the beginning of the session. "Is there a problem here, Officer Kane?" the judge asked, her voice cutting through the tension. Kane looked at Tamara, then back at the judge. He was about to speak, but then he froze. "No, Your Honor," he muttered, visibly unsettled. Tamara didn't react, but inside, she was already preparing for the moment that would change everything. She wasn't just any random woman who had walked into the courtroom. She was there to do a job, and before long, the truth would come out, leaving everyone stunned. Tamara watched as the proceedings began, her eyes scanning the room, noting the small details, the way the judge interacted with the lawyers, the way the officers behaved. Every moment, every action was being recorded. She wasn't just observing. She was evaluating. And soon, her true identity would be revealed, leaving Officer Kane and everyone else in the room in disbelief. As the judge took her seat, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Tamara remained composed, her eyes scanning the room methodically. She wasn't just here to witness the case unfold. She was here for something much bigger. As the proceedings began, Officer Kane took his place at the back of the courtroom, his earlier arrogance now replaced by a hint of unease. He kept glancing over at Tamara, as though he were expecting something to happen, though he couldn't quite place what it was. The trial continued without incident, but Tamara's mind was already working behind the scenes. She noticed the subtle exchange of glances between the judge and the lawyers, the way the witnesses were treated, and the faint smirk that appeared on the prosecutor's face whenever a certain type of question was asked. Every detail was part of the larger picture she was piecing together. As the session drew on, Tamara remained quiet, observing every interaction. The tension in the room had lessened, but there was an underlying current of discomfort that only she seemed to pick up on. Then, during a brief recess, the judge stood and walked over to her. "Ms. Johnson, could I speak with you for a moment?" she asked in a tone that was calm, but not without authority. Tamara stood, her gaze steady. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied, her voice as calm as ever. They walked to the side of the courtroom, where the judge leaned in slightly, her tone lowering. "I know who you are," the judge said, her voice a whisper that only Tamara could hear. "I've been briefed about the federal investigation you're leading." Tamara didn't flinch, her expression unreadable. "I appreciate your cooperation, Your Honor," she said simply. The judge paused for a moment, then continued. "That officer, Kane, he's trouble. We've been dealing with his attitude for years. I didn't think it was my place to act, but now I see you're in a position to make a difference." Tamara nodded slowly, her mind already calculating the best way to proceed. "Thank you for the information," she said, her tone polite yet firm. "I'll handle it from here." The judge returned to her seat, and Tamara stepped back into the crowd of onlookers. She could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, but she didn't let it faze her. She knew what she had to do next. As the recess ended and the trial resumed, Tamara's mind was fully focused on the task at hand. She wasn't just here to watch the events unfold. She was here to ensure that justice was served and that those who abused their power were held accountable. She knew that revealing her true identity would be the turning point. Soon, the time would come to expose Officer Kane for who he really was, and in doing so, she would reveal the cracks in the system that needed to be fixed. The clock was ticking, and Tamara was ready. She had the evidence, the power, and the determination to see this through. And when the moment came, no one in that courtroom would be able to deny the truth. Officer Kane would have nowhere to hide. The trial continued, but the tension in the room was thicker than before. Tamara's mind was sharp, focused on the events unfolding before her. She was gathering information, assessing every move, every word. Officer Kane, still unaware of her true role, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes occasionally flickered to Tamara, as though he could sense something was off, but he couldn't place it. Tamara knew the moment was fast approaching. She had been patient, observing the system, noting every flaw, every action that hinted at deeper corruption. The way some officers treated witnesses, the indifference of others, and the overall lack of accountability. She had seen enough. The time to act was near. As the session continued, the prosecutor stood up to present his case, speaking confidently, but Tamara's thoughts remained focused on Officer Kane. She had a feeling he was hiding something bigger than a simple case of misconduct. Her instincts told her that exposing him would not only bring justice to this trial, but also shine a light on a much larger issue. With each passing moment, the need to reveal her true identity grew stronger. Tamara's role as an undercover inspector was more than just a job. It was a mission to root out corruption and ensure that power was never abused. And Officer Kane, as arrogant and dismissive as he was the perfect example of everything that was wrong with the system. As the prosecutor finished his statement, Tamara stood up, her voice calm but firm. The room went silent, all eyes on her. "Your Honor, I need to address the court," she said, her words cutting through the tension like a knife. The judge, momentarily taken aback, nodded for her to continue. "I am Tamara Johnson, a federal inspector with the Department of Justice. I've been assigned to evaluate this courtroom, including the actions of its officers and legal professionals. I've gathered evidence that points to serious misconduct by Officer Kane," she announced. The room gasped. The atmosphere shifted, and the whispers began, rippling through the onlookers. Officer Kane's face turned pale, his earlier confidence crumbling as the reality of the situation hit him. What is this?" he stammered, looking at the judge, who was now studying Tamara with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. "This is a federal investigation, Officer Kane. You've been under scrutiny for your actions, and it's time for you to face the consequences," Tamara said, her voice unwavering. The judge leaned forward, her expression now one of stern authority. "Officer Kane, I suggest you step down while we address this matter. The court will not tolerate any further actions that undermine its integrity," she said. Officer Kane opened his mouth to protest, but the words didn't come. He knew his fate had been sealed. Tamara had already proven her point. The courtroom, which had been tense with anticipation, was now filled with an overwhelming sense of justice being restored. Officer Kane's disgrace was imminent, and the system that had allowed his misconduct to continue was beginning to crack. Tamara's gaze remained steady, her eyes locked onto Kane as the weight of the moment settled in. She had done what she came to do: expose the truth, reveal the corruption, and ensure that justice would prevail. The room was silent as the realization of what had just occurred sank in. Tamara had flipped the script. She had taken control of the situation and turned the tables on those who thought they held all the power. And as she stood there, watching Officer Kane's fall from grace, she knew this was just the beginning. The fight for justice had only just begun, and she was ready to take on whatever came next. The courtroom was now buzzing with activity. The shock of Tamara's revelation still hung in the air, but the proceedings had to continue. Officer Kane, visibly shaken, had been escorted out, leaving the room in a tense, uncomfortable silence. Tamara took a seat once again, her posture calm and composed, as though nothing extraordinary had just occurred. The whispers among the court staff and the audience slowly quieted, but the weight of her words had not yet fully settled. The judge cleared her throat, regaining control of the room. "This court will proceed with the next phase," she said, her voice steady but firm. "We will address the misconduct charges against Officer Kane, and we will do so with the utmost seriousness." The judge glanced at Tamara before continuing. "Thank you for your timely intervention, Ms. Johnson. We will proceed with the proper investigations." Tamara nodded in acknowledgement, her focus unwavering. The room slowly returned to its routine, but there was a subtle shift in the air. The power dynamic had changed. For the first time in what seemed like forever, the scales of justice were actually tilting in favor of those who had long been silenced. As the next witness was called, Tamara's thoughts drifted back to the larger picture. Her role here wasn't just about one officer's misconduct. It was about the deeper systemic issues that plagued this courtroom and many like it. She had gathered evidence, but the real work was just beginning. Officer Kane was a small piece of the puzzle. What she had uncovered today would only be the first step in a much larger investigation. As the trial continued, Tamara kept her attention sharp. The prosecutor had called in the next set of witnesses, and their testimonies were critical in moving the case forward. But her mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the conversations she'd had with the judge earlier. The judge, who had recognized the importance of Tamara's role, had quietly acknowledged the systemic flaws that Tamara was there to expose. Tamara's quiet resolve remained steady. She was in this for the long haul. She wasn't just going to watch a few bad officers get removed from duty. No, she was here to dismantle a broken system and rebuild it from the inside out. She had the support of those who truly understood the stakes. As the day wore on, Tamara's patience began to pay off. The court session was drawing to a close, but it was clear that things were no longer the same. The judge had already made it known that Officer Kane's actions would be fully investigated. But there was more work to be done. Tamara was just one part of a larger team working behind the scenes, and she knew that the next phase of the investigation would require even more scrutiny, more courage, and a lot more perseverance. As the court adjourned, the crowd slowly began to filter out of the room. Tamara stayed seated for a moment longer, reflecting on what had just happened. She knew the day's events had shaken the foundation of this courtroom, but it was just the beginning of what would be a long and difficult journey. She had made a statement today, but there was still much left to do. The corruption, the injustice, the systemic failures, all of it had to be exposed, and she was ready to continue the fight. As she walked out of the courtroom, Tamara felt a sense of quiet determination settle over her. She had set the wheels in motion, but the real battle was still ahead. And no matter what came next, she was ready to face it head on. As the days passed, the ripple effects of the courtroom incident continued to unfold. Tamara's role had only just begun, but the momentum she had created was undeniable. The investigation into Officer Kane was now in full swing, but Tamara knew that this was just the first step in exposing a deeper, more systemic issue. The Department of Justice had already begun gathering additional resources, and she was not working alone. Behind the scenes, a team of investigators and legal professionals had been mobilized to assist her. Each one as determined as she was to ensure that justice was not just an ideal, but a reality. Tamara's thoughts often returned to the judge, who had quietly voiced her support for the investigation. That conversation had stuck with her. It wasn't just about removing a corrupt officer from duty. It was about changing a system that had allowed that corruption to thrive. As Tamara sat in her office one afternoon, reviewing case files, she received a call from the judge. "Ms. Johnson, I wanted to thank you again for your efforts. What you did was brave, but I know it's only the beginning. We've been discussing this, and we're ready to support the next steps," the judge said, her tone sincere but filled with quiet urgency. Tamara leaned back in her chair, absorbing the words. "I appreciate that, Your Honor," she replied. "But the work is far from over. Kane may be just one example, but there are others, many others who are just as entrenched in this system." The judge's voice grew more serious. "I agree, and that's why we need to take action, not just with Kane, but across the board. The public needs to see that we're serious about making changes. We have to act quickly before this issue becomes a stain on the entire system." Tamara nodded, already considering the logistics. She had always known that the road ahead would be long, but the judge's words only reinforced the gravity of the mission. It was bigger than Officer Kane. It was bigger than any individual. This was about reshaping the very foundations of justice. As the investigation deepened, Tamara found herself juggling her role as an inspector with her own growing sense of responsibility. She had to maintain her objectivity, but she couldn't ignore the emotional weight of the cases she was reviewing. Every document, every interview, every piece of evidence painted a picture of a system that was rotting from the inside out. The more she uncovered, the more Tamara realized that her work would not be an easy task. It would require patience, persistence, and a level of courage that she knew would be tested at every turn. But she was resolute. Her conviction had only strengthened. She had seen the injustice with her own eyes, and now she was determined to make sure that it no longer went unnoticed. The next phase of the investigation was about to begin, and this time, Tamara would take the next steps with a renewed sense of purpose. The challenges ahead were uncertain, but one thing was clear. She was ready to face them head-on. She was no longer just an observer. She was an agent of change. And no matter how tough the road ahead seemed, Tamara Johnson was committed to seeing it through, no matter the cost. The investigation continued to grow more complex with each passing day. Tamara Johnson was no longer just an observer. She was the one driving the change, uncovering layer after layer of corruption that had long been hidden beneath the surface. As the days turned into weeks, she found herself at the heart of an ongoing battle for justice. She spent countless hours reviewing files, interviewing witnesses, and examining records that spanned years. Each piece of evidence revealed a system deeply entrenched in its own dysfunction, with corruption reaching far beyond Officer Kane. Despite the weight of the task ahead, Tamara felt a growing sense of purpose. Her work was more than just a job now. It was a mission to expose the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made those in power. As she walked through the corridors of the Department of Justice one afternoon, she received another call from the judge. "Ms. Johnson, I wanted to update you on the situation. The public is starting to pay attention to what's happening. There's growing support for your investigation," the judge said. Tamara paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "That's good to hear, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady. "But we can't stop here. Kane may be out, but there are still so many others who think they are untouchable." "I agree," the judge responded. "But the pressure is mounting. We have to move quickly before those who are implicated can cover their tracks." Tamara felt the weight of her responsibility more than ever. The pressure was real, but she knew that this was what she had signed up for. She had to push forward. The next phase of the investigation was critical. It was time to bring those responsible into the light. Tamara worked tirelessly, coordinating with federal agents, reviewing surveillance footage, and analyzing the behavior of officers who had been previously overlooked. She was methodical in her approach, never allowing personal feelings to cloud her judgment. But as she uncovered more, she realized just how far the corruption had spread. It wasn't just a few bad officers. It was a network of individuals working together to maintain the status quo, turning a blind eye to the needs of the community and perpetuating a system that benefited only the corrupt. As the investigation picked up pace, Tamara began to see the first real signs of change. Several high-ranking officials were placed under investigation, and the media had started to pick up on the story. The public was beginning to demand answers, and for the first time in a long time, it felt as though the truth might actually be heard. Tamara's team worked day and night, gathering information, building cases, and preparing for the eventual moment when they would reveal everything. But the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things became. Tamara knew that those in power would stop at nothing to protect themselves. She couldn't afford to let her guard down. Every day brought new challenges, new risks, but she was ready. She had come this far, and she was determined to see it through to the end. She was no longer just an inspector. She was a force for justice. And as the walls of corruption began to crumble around her, Tamara Johnson knew that this was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but she was prepared to continue the battle, no matter the cost. As the investigation progressed, Tamara felt the weight of her responsibility grow heavier each day. The pressure was mounting, not just from the public and the media, but also from the system itself. The corrupt officers and officials she was uncovering had deep ties, and it was clear that they would do whatever it took to protect themselves. Yet, Tamara remained resolute. She was no longer simply uncovering misconduct. She was tearing down an entire system of corruption that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Her team had made significant progress, but with every step forward, they encountered new obstacles. Some of the key figures they had targeted were beginning to cover their tracks more carefully, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to stay one step ahead. The walls that had once seemed so vulnerable were starting to rebuild themselves. But Tamara was prepared. She knew that the fight for justice would never be easy, and she was willing to make sacrifices. It was late one evening when Tamara received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, her contact within the Department of Justice. "Tamara, we've got a breakthrough. One of the key witnesses has agreed to testify. This could be the final piece we need to bring everything down." Tamara's pulse quickened as she sat up straighter in her chair. This was the moment she had been waiting for. She had known that the truth would eventually come to light, but hearing it from her source made it feel tangible, real. "This is it," she said, her voice filled with determination. "We can't waste any time. Set up the meeting, and let's make sure we've got everything ready." The witness, a former officer who had been working with the corrupt network, was finally willing to speak. Tamara knew this person's testimony could unravel the entire conspiracy, but she also understood the risks. Whistleblowers in cases like these didn't always make it out unscathed. She had to ensure the witness's safety and protect the integrity of the case. The next few days were filled with frantic preparation. Tamara worked closely with her team, ensuring every detail was in place. The legal team had already been briefed, and security measures were being put into effect to protect the witness and their family. As they finalized everything, Tamara couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency. This was the moment they had all been working toward. When the day of the testimony finally arrived, Tamara stood in the back of the room, watching the proceedings unfold. The witness stepped up to the stand, their face covered by a mask for protection. The room fell silent as the truth began to spill out, stories of bribery, manipulation, and abuse of power that reached all the way to the highest levels of law enforcement. Tamara's heart raced as the witness provided crucial evidence, linking Officer Kane and others to a network of corruption that had been thriving unchecked for years. With each new revelation, the room grew more tense. The defense tried to discredit the witness, but it was clear they had no case left to stand on. As the testimony continued, Tamara felt a surge of hope. This was the turning point. The system was finally beginning to break down. When the final words were spoken and the witness left the stand, the judge called for a recess. Tamara stepped outside the courtroom, taking a deep breath of fresh air. She felt the weight of the moment, the culmination of months of work and dedication. The fight wasn't over, but this was a significant victory. The corruption that had once seemed so invincible was finally being exposed for the world to see. Tamara knew the battle was far from won, but today was a reminder that justice had a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep it was buried. The courtroom was filled with a heavy, charged silence as the recess ended. Tamara stood in the back, watching as the attorneys returned to their positions, the weight of what had just transpired settling over her like a blanket. The testimony from the whistleblower had been explosive, shaking the foundation of the case to its core. The walls of corruption were starting to crumble, but the fight was far from over. As the judge called the room back to order, Tamara knew this was just the beginning. The prosecutor stood up to present the next phase of the case, his voice confident, but with an undercurrent of tension. It was clear that the defense would do everything in its power to discredit the evidence and the witness. But Tamara had seen enough to know that the truth was on their side. The defense tried their best to cast doubt, questioning the motives of the whistleblower and challenging the validity of the evidence. But each time they made an accusation, it was met with a well-prepared rebuttal from the prosecution. Tamara couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Every question from the defense seemed to backfire, only solidifying the case against the officers involved in the corruption. It wasn't just the evidence that was overwhelming, it was the sheer determination of the people who had fought to expose the truth. As the hours wore on, the courtroom slowly began to feel more like a battlefield. The defense, struggling to maintain their ground, launched into a final series of questions aimed at poking holes in the whistleblower's story. But Tamara knew better. This witness wasn't just telling a story. They were telling the truth, and nothing could erase that. The final witness was called a former colleague of Officer Kane, who had been involved in some of the more shady dealings that had been exposed. The testimony was powerful, adding even more weight to the already damning evidence. With every word that came from the witness's mouth, the room seemed to grow heavier. The defense had no way to fight back against the flood of truth that was pouring in. As the witness finished their testimony, the judge paused, giving everyone in the room a moment to absorb what had just been said. Tamara could feel the collective breath of the room as it held its place, waiting for the next move. "I think we've heard enough," the judge finally said, her voice cutting through the tension. "This case is moving forward." Tamara's heart raced as she stood in the back, watching the final moments of this stage unfold. The decision had been made. The system was finally taking a stand against the corruption that had festered for so long. The officers who thought they were untouchable were now facing the consequences of their actions. As the session adjourned for the day, Tamara felt a wave of relief wash over her. But she knew this wasn't the end. The case was far from over, and there would be more obstacles to overcome before the final victory was achieved. But in that moment, Tamara allowed herself to feel a small sense of triumph. The wheels of justice were turning, and nothing would stop them now. The trial moved into its final phase, and with every passing day, the pressure on Tamara grew. What had started as a quiet investigation into the corruption of a few officers had now escalated into a public spectacle, with news outlets covering the case from every angle. The courtroom was a scene of constant tension, the media frenzy outside only adding to the weight of the moment. Despite this, Tamara remained focused, her resolve unshaken. She knew that this wasn't just about the officers involved in this case. It was about something much bigger. It was about creating a system where justice truly prevailed, no matter who you were or how much power you held. The defense team, battered by the mounting evidence and testimonies, had one final attempt to sway the court. They tried to plant seeds of doubt, suggesting that the witnesses had personal grudges or were biased in their testimonies. But Tamara wasn't worried. She had seen this tactic used before. The truth, as painful as it was for the defense, was undeniable. As the defense wrapped up their argument, the room was heavy with anticipation. Tamara could feel the eyes of everyone on her, waiting for the judge's decision. The room fell silent as the judge stood, the gavel resting lightly in her hand. After considering all the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds the defendants guilty of misconduct, corruption, and abuse of power. The judge said, her voice unwavering. There was a moment of stillness before the room erupted into hushed murmurs. Tamara felt a surge of relief wash over her. This was the moment she had worked for, the moment when justice had been served. But even as the verdict was announced, Tamara knew that the battle wasn't over. This case was just one example of the larger systemic issues at play. As the courtroom began to empty, Tamara stood by the doors, watching the crowd disperse. Her phone buzzed with messages, congratulations, support, but also a reminder of the road ahead. The fight for justice was never a one-time victory. It was a continual struggle. As Tamara left the courthouse that day, she felt a quiet satisfaction. The weight of the past months had been heavy, but she had made a difference. She had exposed the cracks in the system and shown that even the most powerful could be held accountable. But her work wasn't finished. There were still more people to protect, more injustices to expose, and a system that needed constant vigilance. As she walked down the steps, the sun setting in the distance, Tamara knew that this was only the beginning. The wheels of justice were in motion, and she would continue to fight for what was right, no matter what challenges lay ahead. Justice had been served, but the journey was far from over.